On Plugged In, President Joe Biden gets to work.
We didn't get into this mess overnight. It's going to take time for us to turn things around.
From vaccine distribution and reviving the economy to repairing alliances and dealing with threats, challenges abound for the new American president.
So what I'm hoping is that Biden will have a new vision.
Perspectives on the priorities and personality of a new U.S. president on Plugged In, the new Biden administration. Hello and welcome to Plugged In. I'm Greta Van Susteren, reporting from Washington, D.C., where new leadership is making its presence felt. President Joe Biden ushered in his new administration with a slew of executive orders and a plea for Americans to voluntarily wear a mask in public for the next 100 days to combat the coronavirus pandemic. He is requiring mask wearing in federal government buildings and aboard planes, trains, and buses. Biden reversed numerous Trump administration policies, such as ending construction of a wall along the border with Mexico. He is also dropping the ban on people entering the United States from several Muslim-majority countries. The new president also brought the U.S. back into the Paris Climate Accords and the World Health Organization. Both moves have been welcomed by allies around the world. More from London and VOA's Henry Ridgwell.
After 4 years of turbulent transatlantic relations, the European Union Commission head offered a warm welcome for President Joe Biden.
Once again, after 4 long years, Europe has a friend in the White House. From climate change to health, from digitalization to democracy, these are global challenges that need renewed and improved global cooperation.
British Prime Minister Boris Johnson had a warmer relationship with former President Trump, but Johnson said Wednesday he and Biden have a joint common agenda.
It's a fantastic thing for America. It's a step forward for the country that's been through a bumpy period.
There were big celebrations in Kosovo, where a street bears the name of Joe Biden's late son, Beau Biden, who worked in the country with the US Justice Department following the 1999 Kosovo War. US allies in the Asia-Pacific region also welcomed the new US administration.
There's a lot of work for us together, whether it's on climate, on energy, on international security, and importantly regional security here in the Indo-Pacific.
Japan's Prime Minister echoed his Australian counterpart.
I hope to closely cooperate with the new president to achieve a free and open Indo-Pacific region.
That a clear reference to the perceived threat from China in the Indo-Pacific region. In Beijing, a call for a reset in relations with Washington.
We hope that the new U.S. government will view China and our relations in an objective and rational manner.
China Wednesday sanctioned outgoing former Secretary of State Mike Pompeo and dozens of other Trump officials. Biden's National Security Council called the sanctions unproductive and cynical, a response some analysts say is not surprising.
The incoming administration will also maintain a pretty tough on China stance. It's actually an era where I think we'll have some bipartisan agreement on that approach, but one that is again more engaged with allies in doing that.
Meanwhile, Iran's leader said the ball was in Biden's court over the future of the 2015 nuclear deal, which the US president has said he wants to rejoin if Tehran meets its commitments. Russia's ambassador to the US called Biden's inauguration a new chapter in relations with Washington. Henry Ridgwell for VOA News, London.
The foreign policy challenges that will face the Biden administration are vast. Michael O'Hanlon is a senior fellow and director of foreign policy research at the Brookings Institution in Washington. We discussed some of the most pressing foreign policy issues facing the Biden-Harris administration.
You know, Biden's been a supporter of expanding NATO and bringing it eastward, and we've promised to someday bring Ukraine and Georgia, former Soviet republics, into NATO. That is just, as you know, so incendiary for the Russians. It's not the only issue on which we disagree with the Russians, but it's maybe the issue that we sort of created ourselves where on most of the other issues, it was Russian bad behavior that created the issue. And so Biden's going to have to be, I think, a little bit clever, because if he leaves the basic strategy as it's been, keep trying to expand NATO to the east, for example, and then, of course, face down Putin, where you do have to challenge him on issues like Russian tinkering in our elections, Russian suppression of its own democracy, Russian aggression in the broader Middle East. Those issues we have to oppose Putin. But if you also continue to try to push the idea of eventual NATO expansion, then I think you're guaranteeing a bad relationship with Russia, when it doesn't have to be that way, and it's dangerous for it to be quite that way. So what I'm hoping is that Biden will have a new vision for European security, especially for the neutral or non-aligned countries that include the former Soviet republics I just mentioned, as well as some other places like Armenia and Azerbaijan, even down to Cyprus, even up to Finland and Sweden, and try to think of how we can stabilize that zone. And also get Russia to stop aggressing against Ukraine and find a new stable concept for Europe. To me, that is the big challenge, but I'm not really sure I've heard anybody on the Biden team tilt that way yet, so I hope they will.
How do you factor in the fact that Iran's top scientist has recently been assassinated? Iran has at least said that it is further enriching uranium.
Well, I think that the assassination of the Iranian scientist is the sort of thing that will reinforce hostility and anger inside of Iran. But we also know that regime is frankly one of the coldest, most calculating, and most Machiavellian on the planet. And I'm sure there'll be a fair amount of anger, but there won't be a lot of sentimentality about the path forward. I think in the end, they will watch out for their own national interest, with or without this scientist being alive. And so I think what you're going to see is Iran try to figure out how the world reacts if and when Biden comes in and says, you know, the 2015 deal was pretty good for the time, but times are different, and I need something a little broader and longer lasting. And at first, that will not be something Iran wants to hear, and Iran will test the waters to see if America's European allies, as well as Russia and China, will really go along with that approach, or maybe if the United States can be isolated in its desire for a broader arrangement. So that'll, I think, be the initial conversation. I think it's going to be fascinating to watch. This is going to be one of the huge areas of change, because we know the Trump administration withdrew from the 2015 nuclear deal and had something tantamount to a regime change policy towards Iran. Extremely hard line. Was not really joined by most of the rest of the world in that policy, and it's not clear where that policy could realistically have led, but it did apply a lot of additional pressure on Iran. And then you throw COVID on top of that, Iran is hurting. So that's the situation that Biden inherits. And he also inherits a situation where, in this particular case, on this issue, Trump was not an outlier relative to most Republicans. Most Republicans were very critical of the 2015 nuclear deal because it did not restrict Iran's other activities, such as support for Assad in Syria. And it also began to expire within 8 to 10 years of the implementation of that deal. Many of the quantitative restrictions on nuclear activity actually begin to relax in 2023. So I think Biden's got a more difficult job ahead than simply returning to the deal. That's going to be what Iran expects and demands at first. But Iran may not really have the luxury of holding to that hard line given the state of its economy. And so Biden may be looking for some kind of an interim arrangement which lifts some economic pressure and sanctions on Iran, but also refuses to lift them all until there is a longer lasting deal or a broader deal that would engender some Republican support in the United States as well. It's going to be quite a challenge. And for a team that is so vested in this deal, because basically everybody on the senior Biden team was part of the Obama team that negotiated the 2015 Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action, they're going to have to be a little bit intellectually flexible to figure out a new path forward rather than just returning to their own baby in the form of the 2015 deal.
Turning to China, what do you see with the new administration?
Even within the first term of Trump, he went from trying to buddy up with Xi Jinping in the first year to then engaging in a protracted trade war, but then sometimes trying to back off that trade war. And yes, some of that was the peculiarity of Donald Trump, but it also reflected the changing view of China in the United States in economic as well as security circles. I think we are in a new era of our relations with what's become the other great superpower on the planet. I would already give China that designation myself. And so I think we're going to have a complex relationship we haven't yet sorted out.
How does the coronavirus and also even the humanitarian issues like the treatment of the Uyghurs, how does that factor into a Biden presidency?
Well, those are two issues where complication and competitiveness are going to be part of the new relationship regardless. They're two of the reasons why. Although on coronavirus, it's actually more complex. With the treatment of the Uyghurs and also Hong Kong and also Christians in China and dissent and dissidents in China, there's no ambiguity. Those are all negatives from an American point of view. On COVID-19, what we see here is that, first of all, China may have been the cause, but it's also been part of the solution. It's figured out how to handle this virus better than most Western countries. Also, we have pandemics that could happen in the future that we have to work hard to prevent, and China's got to be part of that conversation. You don't solve that problem with an adversarial relationship or a rivalrous one. That's an example of where we need to cooperate with China. So it's going to be a relationship that's one part competitiveness, one part cooperation. The key is to make sure there's not another part that's outright conflict. I think that has to be the goal. But actually making that happen is, of course, a very complex proposition.
One of the problems that has troubled every recent American president is North Korea and its nuclear weapon ambition. And no one has seemed to be able to figure out how to handle North Korea and now Kim Jong-un. We've ignored him. We've had sanctions. President Trump tried to talk to him, tried to make almost friends with him. What will President Biden do about North Korea, because it is marching forward with its nuclear weapon program and its missile program?
Well, I hope that President Biden will be a little more flexible on North Korea. And I don't want to say that he should imitate what President Trump did, but he might want to take 1 or 2 pages out of the long playbook, most of which was a failure by Trump. But it's worth remembering that Obama failed too, and so did George W. Bush. You know, the overall effort to constrain North Korea's nuclear weapons programs, long-range missile programs, has failed under presidents of both parties. And when President-elect Trump visited Washington 4 years ago and President Obama hosted him for the traditional visit of the type that hasn't happened this year, unfortunately, but when Obama was more gracious to Trump than Trump has been to Biden, at that meeting, Obama acknowledged that North Korea policy had been a great failing of his presidency. And Trump took that to heart, by all accounts, and decided he needed to try something radically new. And he tried several things that were radically new, first threatening war in the fall of 2017, and then buddying up to Kim Jong-un with the 3 summits. And then all that petered out, and we didn't really get a negotiation strategy that either side was willing to pursue thereafter. So what I hope Biden will do is pick up on the notion that, first of all, high-level engagement with Kim Jong-un or his government is a good idea. I'm not suggesting that Biden should have summit diplomacy without any deliverables, but there should be intense, high-level engagement with people who can speak for the President of the United States and make a deal. And then secondly, we need to be flexible and realistic about what that deal could entail. We need a little bit of the art of the deal, even though Donald Trump himself could not deliver that deal. And I think it means accepting and acknowledging North Korea is not going to give up all of its nuclear weapons right away. They have too much fear about attack. That is too much a legacy of the father and grandfather of Kim Jong-un. We need a partial deal that in the short term freezes North Korea's ability to make any more bombs. And then in return for that, there's a partial lifting of sanctions. And you leave the longer term disarmament for the longer term. I think if Biden can be pragmatic in that regard, he has much better prospects for success.
How is he going to differ from his former boss in terms of foreign policy, President Obama? Is he going to be a lot like him, or is he going to be different? Is he going to be his own man?
You know, that's just a fascinating question because, you know, he should try to be his own man, clearly, even if he keeps some of the Obama philosophy. But you could argue, and certainly many people have argued, that Obama himself was sort of running out of gas in his foreign policy by the end of his second term. That in his first term, he had this team of rivals, Bob Gates, Hillary Clinton. He was projecting big visions and ideas for the world. And in the second term, he was sort of just trying to minimize America's, burdens and losses in places like Afghanistan. He had to deal with the rise of ISIS. He had to deal with the return of Russia and the growing strength of China. And he didn't quite seem to adopt policies that were up to most of these challenges very quickly. So in that regard, Biden, a much older guy and much more a creature of traditional Washington, is going to have to be more innovative than second-term Obama.
Michael, thank you very much. Always nice to talk to you.
Greta, thanks for having me on.
President Biden has laid out an ambitious plan to address his top priorities in the first 100 days of his presidency. He wants more money to fight COVID-19 and the economic crisis the pandemic has caused. Biden also wants an expansion of the Voting Rights Act to reduce barriers that keep some people from voting. He also wants the United States to be a leader on the issue of climate change. Accomplishing these goals requires the agreement of the U.S. Congress. Getting legislation passed will be easier for Biden now that Democrats hold the majority, although a slim majority, in Congress. VOA congressional correspondent Katherine Chipson explains.
I, Joseph Robinette Biden Jr., do solemnly swear.
As he takes office, U.S. President Joe Biden faces considerable challenges. First among them, combating the coronavirus that has killed more than 400,000 Americans.
It requires Congress coming together to provide the necessary funding in the COVID relief package and the American Rescue Plan that I will soon be sending to the Congress.
Please raise your right hand.
But with Vice President Kamala Harris,
Do you solemnly swear?
And 3 new senators, Democrats now have control of the U.S. Senate under now Majority Leader Chuck Schumer.
The Senate will tackle the perils of the moment, a once-in-a-generation health and economic crisis, and it will strive to make progress on generations-long struggle for racial justice, economic justice, equality of opportunity, and equality under the law.
An ambitious agenda for Democrats to pursue, but control of both the White House and both chambers of Congress helps clear the way.
Knowing that the president is of the same party, they know that anything that comes out of Congress is likely to get his signature on the bill, instead of having a back and forth about a veto and trying to come up with a larger base of the Congress to vote on something to override any potential veto threat from the president. So it basically comes with unity and agenda control.
But Democrats have narrow margins in both chambers of Congress, and Republicans will still be able to block some bills that require 60 votes for passage in the Senate. In the House, Speaker Nancy Pelosi can only lose a few Democratic votes, and she has suggested there could be ways to work with Republican lawmakers.
We have a responsibility to find bipartisanship where we can, to find our common ground.
Quick passage of a new round of coronavirus relief for a struggling American economy comes first. But the new Democratic Senate will also move quickly to confirm the Biden cabinet nominees awaiting hearings.
The nomination is confirmed.
Unified control also gives the nation's legislative branch a greater ability to enforce government accountability. And within days, the ultimate exercise in checks and balances will begin.
I'm actually hopeful for this. In terms of the impeachment and how that is affected going forward, there's no greater sign of accountability than Congress literally holding a presidential impeachment trial. And we, of course, have never seen one after a president has left office. So it's kind of the optimum of Congress sticking up for itself and making sure that a president is paying attention, or at least doesn't think of himself as above the law.
Despite their new majority, Democrats will still need to persuade 17 Republicans to convict former President Donald Trump if they hope to bar him from ever running again for federal office. Katherine Chipson, VOA News, Washington.
Susan Page is the Washington bureau chief for USA Today. She has covered 6 White House administrations. We talked about the challenges facing the new Biden administration. President Biden was vice president for 8 years under President Obama, but he was also in the U.S. Senate, and he was the chairman of the Senate Foreign Relations Committee. What is that going to do when we start looking at foreign policy? I mean, when we start looking at the world, do you have any thoughts on how he's going to think about China, Africa, North Korea, Iran?
So he's got very extensive experience on foreign affairs. As you say, this is something he spent decades looking at in Congress, and then 8 years, of course, as vice president, very involved in foreign affairs. But some of the lessons we might draw from his attitudes in the past, I think, do not apply at this moment. You know, for instance, you look at policy toward China. That is probably the greatest rival that the United States now faces on a world stage. The situation with China is different now than it was even when Obama was president. And so I think that on an issue like that, you're going to see a kind of rethinking about what U.S. policy ought to be. Not that they want to adopt President Trump's policy toward China, but they also don't think it's right to go back to President Obama's policy. They think it's a moment where you have to kind of figure out what's best moving ahead.
Turning to North Korea, another problem for the United States. No president has been able to resolve this. We've tried sanctions in past administrations. President Trump tried to be friends, I guess, for lack of better words, with Kim Jong-un. But meanwhile, North Korea is moving ahead with its nuclear weapons program.
You know, is there any problem in foreign policy that is more difficult than our policy toward North Korea? Because as you say, nothing has worked. I am quite certain that President Biden will not continue President Trump's friendship initiative with the North Korean leader. I wouldn't expect an early summit between them or one without conditions or progress made beforehand. But there are some architects of the earlier North Korea policy who are now going to be participating, now going to be appointed to the Biden State Department. But it is an issue that has really defied solution.
President Trump had sort of a tough love approach with foreign policy, like with NATO. He demanded that the other countries pay what they had earlier agreed to in terms of NATO dues. It seems to me that President Biden is going to have a different approach to many of these world leaders who are allies. Your thoughts?
He's much closer to our allies, our traditional allies, than President Trump ever was. I think he will assert once again our allegiance to NATO. You know, President Trump talked about withdrawing the United States from NATO. That would not be the approach that President Biden would take. You know, he not only has, I think, an appreciation for international alliances, he also knows a lot of these leaders himself because of his long experience in government. It's going to be a very different landscape, I think, a very different fundamental attitude toward alliances than the last 4 years have been.
When President Biden was vice president under President Obama signed an agreement with Iran on their nuclear program, their weapons programs, which President Trump then pulled out of when he became president.
Well, of course, I think that Biden and members of his team wish we had never pulled out of that accord. They supported it. They thought it was flawed, but the best way forward. But at this point, you know, things have happened in the past 4 years. It makes it difficult for the United States to simply try to jump back in to the nuclear accord. And it's not clear that Iran would agree to that automatically either. So I would think negotiations are going to start with that issue because, you know, you're ticking through the most difficult foreign policy and national security challenges that this new president will face. Iran, North Korea, China, you'd have to put those three at the top of the list.
Even some Democrats will give President Trump credit for what was done in the Middle East. There are a lot of new relationships with Israel that's made it a safer place for Israel in the Middle East. What is President Biden going to do about the Middle East? Do you think he'll continue sort of the approach that President Trump has taken, or will he deviate and have his own approach?
Well, I think he'll have his own approach, but I think you're right. I think some in Washington have been surprised by the relative success and the achievements of the Trump administration when it comes to the Middle East and to Israel. You know, as you know, that's a region that's kind of defied the efforts of previous White Houses to make anything that's a lasting peace. I think the number one desire of the Biden administration would be to have less focus on the Middle East, more focus on challenges elsewhere in other regions that they think deserve more attention. And it's possible that some of the steps that the Trump administration is taking will make that more possible. You talk to the Biden people, they would rather talk about Asia than talk about the Middle East.
In the continent of Africa, there hasn't been a lot of discussion with the Trump administration about the continent of Africa, but there are a lot of important things going on. For instance, in Ethiopia, there's a fight over a dam that impacts both Egypt and Sudan. Do you see the United States getting more involved in some of these disputes on other continents or not? Is it going to be hands off? The Trump administration seemed to want to let these countries resolve these things themselves. Some other prior administrations have been more involved and helpful in trying to solve problems.
Yeah. You know, I think the real answer to your question would be, I don't know. But I can tell you that I haven't heard much about Africa in the discussions with Biden folks when they talk about their priorities. So that may be a sign that it is not going to be a first-tier concern for them. But actually, since I haven't talked to them about it, maybe that's wrong.
So I guess we'll have to wait and see, to what extent the African continent goes high up on the radar screen to this White House. Immigration. That's been a thorny problem that the United States has been grappling with for a long time. President Trump started building a wall. President Biden says no more to the wall. And we see video of people making their way towards the United States. President Biden wants a path towards citizenship for a lot of people. So what's going to happen is the U.S. finally going to get an immigration policy of some sort?
This is going to be one of the leading priorities that the Biden White House is going to have. One of the things he's going to do is send a sweeping immigration bill to Capitol Hill. This was President Trump's kind of core issue. It's one thing he talked about that day in 2015 when he announced his presidential campaign. He talked about immigration, the threat of immigration. It's going to be one of the first things that President Biden tries to undo, to reverse some of the steps that President Trump took, including building that wall, and moves ahead on this issue of the Dreamers. This is something that Democrats have been promising since Barack Obama's presidency. In both Obama's presidential campaigns, he promised to try to deal with the issue of the Dreamers. It never got happened. This is one of the things that now lands on Biden's plate.
Susan, thank you very much. Always nice to talk to you.
Greta, thank you.
With the promise to vaccinate 100 million Americans for COVID in its first 100 days, the Biden administration has put ending the pandemic atop its agenda. Thanks in part to strict discipline and the ability to enforce mask wearing and social distancing, the U.S. military has so far contained COVID within its ranks. But there's a new challenge: convincing America's all-volunteer military force to voluntarily take the vaccine. VOA's Bill Gallo reports from Seoul.
The first doses of the coronavirus vaccine arriving at Camp Humphreys, the largest overseas U.S. military base. A big step toward protecting the nearly 30,000 U.S. troops here in South Korea. But at least for now, the military won't be forcing anyone to receive the vaccine. Military officials tell VOA it could be up to 2 years before the U.S. Food and Drug Administration gives the vaccine full approval that would allow it to become mandatory. Colonel Doug Luge, the lead U.S. medical officer in South Korea who spoke to VOA remotely, says it's an unusual situation for military leaders.
Here in the military, especially, the Army, we're not used to telling people to volunteer or asking them to volunteer for things like this. That's been an interesting thing to work through to help make sure people make good, informed decisions.
Like anywhere else, there has been some skepticism about the vaccine, which was developed much more quickly than many expected. To allay those concerns, the military rolled out educational campaigns to combat disinformation. And to set an example, senior leaders were among the first to get the shots.
I think we're hitting about the right tone with that, not ceding the battlefield to the conspiracy theorists, getting the information out there, but on the other hand, not being overbearing or strong-arming people.
Luge says the U.S. military does have experience administering voluntary vaccines, but not at this level or with this much urgency. So far, the plan is working, says Colonel Lee Peters.
Since we've seen the vaccine and the people have kind of observed and watched and did their own research and education, we've seen those numbers grow dramatically to where I would say very few people are now saying, hey, I don't want the vaccine.
Military officials won't say how many have taken the vaccine here in South Korea. For now, frontline health workers and other critical positions are first in line. Eventually, the vaccine will be available to everyone who wants it. But it's not clear when it will be mandatory. Bill Gallo, VOA News, Seoul.
That's all the time we have for now. My thanks to Susan Page from USA Today and Michael O'Hanlon from the Brookings Institution. Keep up with the latest news at voanews.com and follow me on Twitter @Greta. Thank you for being plugged in. Unplugged In, the inauguration of Joe Biden and Kamala Harris.
So help you God?
So help me God.
Congratulations, Mr. President.
The 46th American president is sworn in on the steps of a scarred U.S. Capitol. guarded by thousands of troops around an empty city deserted after protest and pandemic. American history is made with the first woman inaugurated as vice president. Joe Biden lays out his vision for his presidency on Plugged In, the inauguration of Joe Biden and Kamala Harris. Hello and welcome to Plugged In. I'm Greta Van Susteren, reporting from Washington, D.C. Unlike many other countries, the United States does not give, but lends powers to its leaders, and it is loaned in 4-year increments. And at noon on January 20th, that loan power was invested in Joseph R. Biden, who was inaugurated as the new U.S. president. At age 78, Biden is America's oldest president. Also sworn in, Kamala Harris as vice president, becoming the first woman to hold that position. The new president delivered his inauguration speech at the U.S. Capitol, where 2 weeks earlier there was an attack on the Capitol. Ordinarily, there are crowds for the president's inaugural speech, but not this time. This time, the National Mall is guarded by the National Guard troops standing by to repel the risk of a repeated attack. All this amid a coronavirus pandemic and sluggish U.S. economy. President Biden laid out his path forward, calling on all Americans to work together.
This is America's day. This is democracy's day. A day of history and hope, of renewal and resolve. Through a crucible for the ages, America has been tested anew, and America has risen to the challenge. Today, we celebrate the triumph not of a candidate, but of a cause, the cause of democracy. The people, the will of the people has been heard, and the will of the people has been heeded. We've learned again that democracy is precious, democracy is fragile, and at this hour, my friends, democracy has prevailed. So now, on this hallowed ground where just a few days ago, violence sought to shake the Capitol's very foundation, we come together as one nation, under God, indivisible, to carry out the peaceful transfer of power as we have for more than 2 centuries. As we look ahead in our uniquely American way, restless, bold, optimistic, and set our sights on the nation we know we can be and we must be. I thank my predecessors of both parties for their presence here today. I thank them from the bottom of my heart. And I know the resilience of our Constitution and the strength of our nation, as does President Carter, who I spoke with last night, who cannot be with us today, but whom we salute for his lifetime in service. I've just taken the sacred oath each of those patriots have taken, the oath first sworn by George Washington. But the American story depends not on any one of us, not on some of us, but on all of us, on we the people who seek a more perfect union. This is a great nation. We are good people. And over the centuries, through storm and strife, in peace and in war, we've come so far, but we still have far to go. We'll press forward with speed and urgency, for we have much to do in this winter of peril and significant possibilities. Much to repair, much to restore, much to heal, much to build, and much to gain. Few people in our nation's history have been more challenged or found a time more challenging or difficult than the time we're in now. Once-in-a-century virus that silently stalks the country. It's taken as many lives in 1 year as America lost in all of World War II. Millions of jobs have been lost. Hundreds of thousands of businesses closed. A cry for racial justice, some 400 years in the making, moves us. The dream of justice for all will be deferred no longer. A cry for survival comes from the planet itself, a cry that can't be any more desperate or any more clear. And now, a rise of political extremism, white supremacy, domestic terrorism, that we must confront and we will defeat. To overcome these challenges, to restore the soul and secure the future of America, requires so much more than words. It requires the most elusive of all things in a democracy: unity. Uniting to fight the foes we face: anger, resentment and hatred, extremism, lawlessness, violence, disease, joblessness, and hopelessness. With unity, we can do great things, important things. We can right wrongs. We can put people to work in good jobs. We can teach our children in safe schools. We can overcome the deadly virus. We can reward work and rebuild the middle class and make health care secure for all. We can deliver racial justice, and we can make America once again the leading force for good in the world. I know speaking of unity can sound to some like a foolish fantasy these days. I know the forces that divide us are deep and they are real. But I also know they are not new. Our history has been a constant struggle between the American ideal that we're all are created equal and the harsh, ugly reality that racism, nativism, fear, demonization have long torn us apart. The battle is perennial, and victory is never assured. Through Civil War, the Great Depression, World War, 9/11, through struggle, sacrifice, and setbacks, our better angels have always prevailed. In each of these moments, enough of us have come together to carry all of us forward. And we can do that now. History, faith, and reason show the way of unity. We can see each other not as adversaries, but as neighbors. We can treat each other with dignity and respect. We can join forces, stop the shouting, and lower the temperature. For without unity, there is no peace, only bitterness and fury. No progress, only exhausting outrage. No nation, only a state of chaos. This is our historic moment of crisis and challenge, and unity is the path forward. And we must meet this moment as the United States of America. If we do that, I guarantee you we will not fail. We have never, ever, ever, ever failed in America when we've acted together. And so today, at this time, in this place, let's start afresh, all of us. Let's begin to listen to one another again, hear one another, see one another, show respect to one another. Politics doesn't have to be a raging fire, destroying everything in its path. Every disagreement doesn't have to be a cause for total war. And we must reject the culture in which facts themselves are manipulated and even manufactured. My fellow Americans, we have to be different than this. America has to be better than this. And I believe America is so much better than this. Just look around. Here we stand in the shadow of the Capitol Dome, as was mentioned earlier, completed amid the Civil War, when the Union itself was literally hanging in the balance. Yet we endured. We prevailed. Here we stand, looking out on the great mall where Dr. King spoke of his dream. Here we stand, where 108 years ago, at another inaugural, thousands of protesters tried to block brave women marching for the right to vote. And today, we mark the swearing in of the first woman in American history elected to national office, Vice President Kamala Harris. Don't tell me things can't change. To all those who supported our campaign, I'm humbled by the faith you've placed in us. To all those who did not support us, let me say this. Hear me out as we move forward. Take a measure of me and my heart. And if you still disagree, so be it. That's democracy. That's America. The right to dissent peaceably within the guardrails of our republic is perhaps this nation's greatest strength. Yet hear me clearly. Disagreement must not lead to disunion. And I pledge this to you. I will be a president for all Americans. All Americans. And I promise you, I will fight as hard for those who did not support me as for those who did. Many centuries ago, St. Augustine, a saint of my church, wrote that a people was a multitude defined by the common objects of their love. Defined by the common objects of their love. What are the common objects we as Americans love that define us as Americans? I think we know. Opportunity, security, liberty, dignity, respect, honor, and yes, the truth. Recent weeks and months have taught us a painful lesson. There is truth and there are lies. Lies told for power and for profit. And each of us has a duty and a responsibility as citizens, as Americans, and especially as leaders. Leaders who have pledged to honor our Constitution and protect our nation, to defend the truth and defeat the lies. Look, I understand that many of my fellow Americans view the future with fear and trepidation. I understand they worry about their jobs. I understand, like my dad, they lay in bed at night, staring at the ceiling, wondering, can I keep my health care? Can I pay my mortgage? Thinking about their families, about what comes next. I promise you, I get it. But the answer is not to turn inward, to retreat into competing factions, distrusting those who don't look like you, or worship the way you do, or don't get their news from the same sources you do. We must end this uncivil war that pits red against blue, rural versus urban, conservative versus liberal. We can do this if we open our souls instead of hardening our hearts. My fellow Americans, in the work ahead of us, we're going to need each other. We need all our strength to persevere through this dark winter. We're entering what may be the toughest and deadliest period of the virus. We must set aside politics and finally face this pandemic as one nation. One nation. And I promise you this, as the Bible says, weeping may endure for a night, but joy cometh in the morning. We will get through this together. Together. Look, folks, all my colleagues I serve with in the House and the Senate up here, we all understand the world is watching all of us today. So here's my message to those beyond our borders. America has been tested, and we've come out stronger for it. We will repair our alliances and engage with the world once again, not to meet yesterday's challenges, but today's and tomorrow's challenges. And we'll lead not merely by the example of our power, but by the power of our example. We'll be a strong and trusted partner for peace, progress, and security. Look, you all know we've been through so much in this nation. And my first act as president, I'd like to ask you to join me in a moment of silent prayer. Remember all those who we lost in this past year to the pandemic. Those 400,000 fellow Americans, moms, dads, husbands, wives, sons, daughters, friends, neighbors, and co-workers. We'll honor them by becoming the people and the nation we know we can and should be. So I ask you, let's say a silent prayer for those who've lost their lives and those left behind, and for our country. Amen. Folks, this is a time of testing. We face an attack on our democracy and on truth, a raging virus, growing inequity, the sting of systemic racism, a climate in crisis, America's role in the world. Any one of these would be enough to challenge us in profound ways. But the fact is, we face them all at once, presenting this nation with one of the gravest responsibilities we've had. Now we're going to be tested. Are we going to step up, all of us? It's time for boldness, for there is so much to do. And this is certain. I promise you, we will be judged, you and I, by how we resolve these cascading crises of our era. We will rise to the occasion is the question. Will we master this rare and difficult hour? Will we meet our obligations and pass along a new and better world to our children? I believe we must. I'm sure you do as well. I believe we will. And when we do, we'll write the next great chapter in the history of the United States of America, the American story. A story that might sound something like a song that means a lot to me. It's called American Anthem. There's one verse that stands out, at least for me, and it goes like this. The work and prayers of century have brought us to this day. What shall be our legacy? What will our children say? Let me know in my heart when my days are through. America, America, I gave my best to you. Let's us add our own work and prayers to the unfolding story of our great nation. If we do this, then when our days are through, our children and our children's children will say of us, they gave their best, they did their duty, they healed a broken land. My fellow Americans, I close the day where I began, with the sacred oath. Before God and all of you, I give you my word. I will always level with you. I will defend the Constitution. I'll defend our democracy. I'll defend America. And I'll give all of you, keep everything I do in your service, thinking not of power, but of possibilities, not of personal interest, but the public good. And together we shall write an American story of hope, not fear, of unity, not division, of light, not darkness, a story of decency and dignity, love and healing, greatness and goodness. May this be the story that guides us, the story that inspires us, and the story that tells ages yet to come that we answered the call of history. We met the moment. Democracy and hope, truth and justice did not die on our watch but thrived. That America secured liberty at home and stood once again as a beacon to the world. That is what we owe our forebears, one another, and generation to follow. So, with purpose and resolve, we turn to those tasks of our time, sustained by faith, driven by conviction, and devoted to one another and the country we love with all our hearts. May God bless America, and may God protect our troops. Thank you, America.
Before taking office, Joe Biden laid out a set of executive orders he will issue aimed at rolling back some of the most controversial actions of the Trump administration. He will also propose spending nearly $2 trillion to boost the economy and combat the coronavirus pandemic. Susan Page is the Washington bureau chief for USA Today, and she has covered 6 White House administrations. We talked about the challenges facing the new Biden administration.
You know, Greta, it's true that every new president has challenges, but Joe Biden has more challenges, I think it's fair to say, than any president in modern times. And that starts with the pandemic that is still not under control now. More than 400,000 Americans have died. The vaccine rollout, which we're all grateful it started, but it's had a lot of bumps. He's got the economic consequences of that pandemic. Millions of Americans still out of work, some of them at risk of eviction and hunger. And he also has a really divided nation, which was exhibited to our horror by the January 6th assault on the Capitol.
Well, you talk about divide. I'll take that one first. Is the theme of his inauguration speech was unity. How does he achieve unity with 74 million people who wanted President Trump reelected?
You know, his challenge is even greater than all those Americans who voted for the other guy. He takes office in a situation where about a third of Americans don't believe he actually won the election. That, of course, is an argument that former President Trump now made without evidence since the election was held in November. So that's a special burden for Joe Biden. He handled it in his speech today the same way he's been handling it for some time during his campaign and since his election. And that is by saying, I want to be president of all the people. I want to be president of Americans, whether they supported me or not. He's really making an appeal to people on the other side. And that's not a thing every leader has done in the recent past. We'll see if it works.
I think many people would describe President Biden prior to now, he's vice president and senator, as a moderate. And he now has within his own party, as you noted, some people farther to the left of him. He has made promises to them. And so, it does suggest to me that it's going to be a heavy lift to try to get all his Democrats on one page.
Yeah, of course, he's moved a little to the left, as has his party. He is a more liberal politician than he was, say, at the point Obama chose him as his vice president. But he does have centrist instincts. It's almost like whatever you think about the policy, his personal approach is one that comes across as centrist, as can't we make a deal? Can't we find some common ground here? He has made several appointments. Some progressives are disappointed with the appointments he's made. Bernie Sanders, who was the progressive candidate for president, did not get a cabinet post as he wished. But he has appointed a lot of progressive voices, especially to second and third tier positions in agencies.
Many countries around the world have had women as their leaders. The United States has not, but we have now a woman vice president for the very first time. What do you think her impact will be?
Huge, I think. Just the fact that glass ceiling has finally been broken, I think, is an important message to women and girls in this country. It's interesting, Greta. We have, of course, never had a female president. We now have another male president, but the number 2 in line of succession is a female, our first female vice president. Number 3 in line of succession is the House Speaker, Nancy Pelosi, the first woman ever to become Speaker of the House. So you do see progress being made. Number of women in Congress has gone up. And it was interesting in our November election, the number of Republican women in Congress went up. The Republican gains were by and large made by female challenger candidates. So we may see these things happening in both our parties.
Susan, thank you very much. Always nice to talk to you.
Greta, thank you.
Before Biden took the oath of office, Kamala Harris was sworn in as the new vice president. Harris is the first woman and first person of color to be U.S. vice president. She was a first-term senator from the state of California. Before that, she was California's attorney general. Harris attended Howard University, a prestigious historically black college in Washington, D.C. She earned a law degree at the University of California. The inauguration of a new president is accompanied by a trove of traditions, many of which are missing from this inauguration because of COVID and because of the state of alert due to the recent attack on the U.S. Capitol. Capricia Marshall was the White House Chief of Protocol during the first 4 years of the Obama administration. We talked about the logistics and protocols for this moment.
By this time, during a normal, inauguration, boy, oh boy, the streets would be packed, the hotels would be filled. You couldn't get a restaurant reservation, but regrettably, due to our COVID restrictions, which of course we need to adhere to, and then the recent events of just a couple weeks ago, there is a serious lockdown here in Washington, D.C. It is very unusual, and I have to say it's really disconcerting. I go on walks down and around the monuments on weekends. I couldn't do it. It was all blocked off. You could only get so far. And then you just see these high fences. You see this military presence. I mean, strong military presence. And they're not hiding their weaponry either. It is meant to deter. I'm glad it's deterring. I'm so happy it's keeping people safe. But it saddens me that we needed that. It saddens me because it is so contrary to what we stand for as a nation, to what our democracy stands for. This should be a peaceful time of transition. I have to really tip a hat to the inauguration committee that has put together just several days of true celebrations. They have just reconfigured how the country can experience, and perhaps even more people now experience, the celebration of Joe Biden taking the oath of office. The mall has exquisite flags that have been outlined there. The decor is just grand and certainly fitting of the occasion. The programming from moment to moment that anyone in America can tune into will be full of the showcasing the best of our country, the best artisans, the best poets, the best speakers, politicians, just extraordinary individuals. So I'm really in awe of what they did in a short period of time, because you do have to remember that the transition time was really condensed. Usually, as you note, Greta, the sitting president attends the inauguration with the First Lady, and then they walk with the newly inaugurated President and First Lady down the steps. There is a handshake that takes place. Again, these bridging moments of transition, this showcase to the world that our democracy works, that it is strong, it is powerful. These are really some important symbolic moments that we are missing out on because of his decision not to attend this inauguration, because of his decision not to go through these moments in history. And actually, Greta, I have to say, I think for him himself, he's missing these moments in the history books. These are moments that when your children go back and they look them up, when they Google them, that they will see the conference, the transition of power, this peaceful transition take place, and he won't be there. I just think it was not well thought out when it comes to his perspective years from now. But that's the way that it works. And I look forward to January 21st to see how much President Biden and Vice President, historic figure, Kamala Harris, will get done for our great nation. I know that they will do what they intend to do at this inauguration and unite us as a country again.
That's all the time we have for now. Thank you to my guest, former Chief of Protocol, Capricia Marshall, and USA Today's Susan